The search for performance in Formula 1 requires a little bit of genius, some lateral thinking, and a penchant for bending the rules. After all, it's not what's written in the regulations that counts, it's how you interpret them. That's even more imperative when there's a regulation change, and managing to interpret the wording in a different way means you have scope for a lot of interesting developments. The regulation change introduced in 2009 offered an opportunity for such a scenario, and the double diffuser was born. While it will long be remembered as the year that Brawn GP emerged from the ashes of the Honda team and went on to win the World Championship, it was a campaign that was nearly over before it got going. The wide-sweeping rule changes introduced in 2009, with the intent of improving the ability for drivers to follow one another and improve overtaking, had sought to reduce the overall downforce that was achievable. Formula 1's designers were clearly in search of ways of reversing this, and three teams, who at first don't seem remotely connected, universally struck upon the idea of adding a secondary tier to their diffuser. Those teams were Toyota, Williams, and Brawn GP. It's an idea that was reportedly dreamt up by Super Aguri designers, working on plans for what was originally scheduled as a regulation change in 2008, but ex-Honda CEO Nick Fry credits Japanese engineer Sanayuki Minigawa with the idea, thanks to his lateral thinking. The rules introduced for 2009 had set about limiting the dimensions of the diffuser to 1000mm wide, 175mm tall, and 350mm long. But the wording of Article 3, Part 12.7 in the technical regulations meant that designers could create openings on the underside of the car to feed the upper tier of the diffuser, as long as they weren't visible when viewed from directly beneath the car. This was an ingenious workaround that exposed the way in which the regulations had been written. The design didn't go down well with the other teams though, as they knew they had missed a trick, and it would be a nightmare to get a double diffuser on their cars in the short term. So as such, in typical Formula 1 fashion, they protested the design at the Australian Grand Prix, and lobbied the FIA not only to ban the design going forward, but also reverse the result of the Grand Prix, which both Brawn cars had finished in a 1-2 formation. The first time other teams had seen the solutions were at the pre-season test in January, at the Algarve circuit in Portugal. However, for most, it wasn't until Brawn GP arrived with its own version that anyone really stood up and took notice, as the white, black and chartreuse cars set the timing screens alight. Chartreuse. That's a colour. Honestly. So when those scenarios crop up, what happens? Well, it's usually a bit of double dealing. When teams appear to be doing the gentlemanly thing of having the solution banned, they're also hiding their trump card up their sleeve, working on their own solution in case their political manoeuvres backfire. And in this case, the politics failed as the teams were unable to lobby for the double diffuser's removal, which meant they had to fast-track designs from the drawing board and get them on the car as quickly as possible. The scale of that endeavour shouldn't be underestimated, given how having more downforce on the rear end would have to be matched at the front too, so that means that the teams have to keep the aero maps balanced. It simply couldn't be ignored though, given how much downforce could be gained, and so everybody set about introducing their own version. Arguably it was Red Bull who had the biggest challenge on the grid, as they'd reintroduced pull rod suspension at the rear of 2009's RB5. Although this has had an effect on the design of Formula 1 cars since, it would however start to make life a little bit difficult for Adrian Newey and his team. The pull rod at the rear of the RB5 joined the gearbox and crash structure assembly right at the point where the diffuser opens up, making it extremely difficult to get the best from a double diffuser. But with Newey nothing is impossible, and knowing they needed the solution, Red Bull set about making the necessary changes, irrespective of the upheaval it would cause. With the pull rod mounted, the team set about raising their gearbox in order to maximise flow into the upper deck of the double diffuser. The team shaped the underfloor to keep the right airflow occupying the normal diffuser space by tapering it into the crash structure. And sure, Red Bull might have had the biggest challenge to overcome the double diffuser, but that's not to say the others had it easy either. Even though Toyota started the season with a double diffuser, by the second round in Malaysia the team had an even more advanced triple layer variant to boost the rear end downforce. Meanwhile, Ferrari's introductory diffuser design followed the dimensional regulations, But just a few races after the FIA had agreed they'd be allowed, the team had built their own double diffuser, but had to adapt their initial packaging design with multiple different openings into the double diffuser. McLaren's initial design was also respectful of the regulations, but coincidentally, the car was also more suited to a double diffuser than the other cars on the grid. Having clearly been working on a solution in tandem with their protest, they had a solution on the car at the Chinese Grand Prix, just a week after the FIA threw out the team's appeal, which Renault also did. Purchasing its gearbox from McLaren might have helped with the ease of packaging for Force India too, who quickly arrived with their own solution in Bahrain just a week after McLaren. Meanwhile, Braun's own BGP001 might have been considered to have the most refined double diffuser concept on the grid, but that didn't stop the team from making further improvements. In Spain, they altered the shape of the central section, continuing to develop the expansion area to boost rear-end downforce. At the other end of the spectrum, BMW Sauber was one of the last teams to introduce the double diffuser, with a new solution arriving for the Turkish Grand Prix as late as June. The FIA continued to allow double diffusers to be used throughout the course of 2009 and 2010, given the resources expended by everyone to include them in their designs. But from the start of 2011, the regulations loophole that had allowed them in the first place was closed off for good. The teams had already started to exploit another performance avenue in the regulations during 2010, however. Initially combined with the double diffuser, it would become an incredibly potent weapon in the designer's arsenal over the next few years. It was known as the blown diffuser. But that's a whole different story and one we'll have to dive into next time. To hear about blown diffusers as well as other developments such as Coanda effects and more, stay tuned for our next episode of Banned.